Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Inclusive Communication, an Introduction to the Vocabulary of the Disability Community. My name is Yvonne Sims, Network Engagement Manager for Candid, based in Atlanta, and I'm joined by Ebony Carroll, Network Engagement Assistant, also based in Atlanta. We'll be behind the scenes today, supporting today's webinar, as well as collecting questions you ask along the way, and then posing them during the Q&A. For those of you joining us for the first time, we want to share with you that we joined forces with GuideStar to form a new single organization called Candid. Together, we have over 88 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. Every year, millions of nonprofits spend trillions of dollars around the world. Candid finds out where that money comes from, where it goes, and why it matters. We believe that an effective social sector is critical for a thriving society, and we believe in the importance of solutions for the sector by the sector. With Candid, nonprofits, foundations, donors, and the public can all be on the same page. Through research, collaboration, and training, Candid connects people who want to change the world with the resources they need to do it. I'd now like to turn the controls over to our speakers for today. And as I do that, I'll introduce you. I'm also going to give a shout out to one of our speakers who's maybe a little bit more behind the scenes, but helped us get all of this together, Jake Stimmel. And I'll tell you a little bit more about Molly McConville and Christina Lisk. Molly McConville is a development associate at RespectAbility. In her work, McConville is responsible for database management, prospect research, support and development operations, and event planning. McConville graduated from Miami University with a Bachelor of Arts in International Studies and a minor in Spanish. She participated in the RespectAbility National Leadership Program in summer 2019 as a public policy and employment fellow. In her previous role as an employment consultant with Best Buddies, McConville supported individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in their careers. She supported in job coaching, relationship management, fundraising, social media and marketing, and event planning. McConville delivered diversity, equity, and inclusion presentations to companies looking to expand their understanding of disability inclusion. McConville is based in New York City. In her free time, she likes to travel, watch movies, and spend time with family and friends. Christina Lisk is a philanthropy apprentice in RespectAbility's National Leadership Program for Spring 2022. Lisk's apprenticeship was funded by the MacArthur Foundation. An outspoken Philadelphian, Lisk is a writer committed to disability advocacy in the nonprofit sector and the arts. Lisk graduated from Bryn Mawr College, where she studied English literature and creative writing and co-founded the disability group Enable. Her publications include articles for The Mighty, Yahoo Finance, and HearingLikeMe.com, and a short story entitled Fox Hollow Secrets in Nothing Ever Happens in Fox Hollow Anthology Volume 2. In 2019, Lisk presented part of her novel, In Progress, a disability love story at Middlebury Bread Loaf in Sicily. Her previous nonprofit work includes development work at PACT and Citizen Diplomacy International and volunteering as a mentor at Mighty Writers. Lisk believes that generosity is what creates success in social change and the arts. That is why she is interested in the philanthropic sector. The third sector will permit Lisk to bring all of her interests together in a way that balances pragmatism and passion. Lisk wants to design programs where people with disabilities may use creative writing to find empowerment in an ableist world. And with all of those words, I will pass it on to Molly and Christina. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And I will just provide a quick physical description of myself as well. I am a young white woman wearing a black sweater and a low bun. My pronouns are she, her, and hers.
For my physical description, I have red wavy hair that I'm wearing in a half knot. I have a black bow with silver spots on it. I'm wearing a black blazer with a cat moon pin and a snake necklace. I have peace earrings. And let me put it to you this way, I am so white, I make Snow White look like a day at the beach.
And today, Christina and I are going to be talking about inclusive communication, an introduction to the vocabulary of the disability community.
I'm just making sure that everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay.
So, as the screen says, disabilities are temporary and permanent, visible and non-visible, and can be both acquired from birth or acquired later. Here we have individuals with both visible and non-visible disabilities. And while disabilities are not always immediately visible, these can include learning disabilities, chronic illnesses, neurodivergence, and more. So that is why it is so important to ensure that your workplace, school, event space, and all your materials are fully accessible, and that you're requesting accommodations and make sure that everyone feels taken care of. So around 61 million people in the United States have a disability. This means that 1 in 4 adults have a disability, and the likelihood of disability gets higher with age. We like to say that disability does not discriminate. It does not care about your race, gender, sexuality, socioeconomic status, and more. It affects all of us. And some types of disabilities include physical, sensory, cognitive, mental health, and the list goes on.
Anyone can acquire a disability from aging, an accident, trauma, and/or illness. Becoming an ally now can make adapting to having a disability easier. People with disabilities are diverse and part of all communities. Let me continue this point further by interpreting a quote from Batman. You will either die non-disabled in a tragic accident, or you will live long enough to see yourself become disabled. This is a reality for all of us. As mentioned, disability can be acquired from aging. Being an ally now is doing more than just expanding the people who can support your nonprofit and expanding the diversity of your workforce. It's an investment in yourself, in your future. Everything you give to the disability community, you will receive tenfold later in life, be it ableism or be it allyship. And with this giving back, you do not only good for yourself, but for future generations of disabled individuals too.
So the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990. That means we're going on 32, almost 33 years of the ADA. And October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month, so the ADA is often celebrated and brought up this month as it prohibits discrimination against all people with disabilities in all public spaces. As it should be, we all know that, but we still have far to go on the path of full inclusion. For example, religious spaces are not required to be ADA accessible, and so that can prove to be a boundary to some disabled folks. Some background on the term disability: we at RespectAbility use the ADA definition, which defines disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Some of the major life activities mentioned include activities such as caring for oneself, performing manual tasks, walking, seeing, breathing, learning, working, hearing, speaking. Some examples of permanent disabilities include cerebral palsy, spina bifida, Down syndrome, and temporary disabilities are also protected under the ADA. So some of these include recovering from an injury or accident, concussions, impairments following surgery, undergoing medical treatment, and more. So as I mentioned last slide, there's still lots of work to be done for full access and inclusion for people with disabilities. Only 65% of people with disabilities finish high school, 7% of people born with disabilities completed college, and 1 in 3, or I think the specific number is 37% of people with disabilities are employed, as compared to their non-disabled counterparts, which have about a 75% employment rate for working age individuals. This is not because people with disabilities are not capable or willing to work, but because of societal norms and barriers to access, they're not always given the opportunity. And these differences that I just mentioned, once broken down further by race, sexual orientation, and education levels, are even greater. So in order to counteract this, one of our focus areas at RespectAbility is policy. One of the reasons for the differences we see in these numbers between disabled folks and their non-disabled peers are because of the policies and practices that we currently have in place. They hinder individuals with disabilities from fully participating in all aspects of society, including education and employment. In order to change these policies, we need to have people with disabilities sitting at decision-making tables and using their new and different approaches to create sustainable solutions. For example, I live in New York City, and currently only 25% of the New York subway stations are fully accessible. This can make it much more difficult for individuals who use wheelchairs, require Braille to get to work, get to school, and just navigate the city. New Yorkers with disabilities deserve the opportunity to earn an income and achieve independence just like anyone else in the city. So I'll talk a little bit about Respectability. Christina, Jake, and I are all affiliated with Respectability, along with the majority of the people in that last video. Respectability is a diverse, disability-led nonprofit. 88% of our staff identify as an individual with a disability, and our mission is to fight stigmas and advance opportunities so that people with disabilities can fully participate in all aspects of society. So we do this through our 4 pillars: leadership, policy, faith inclusion, and entertainment and news media. Each one of them is its own department and has its own staff. I'll just talk a little bit about each one of them. So leadership, we focus on the National Leadership Program, which is an apprenticeship program for individuals with disabilities in the United States looking to either kickstart their career or get back into the workforce after suffering an accident or taking time off raising kids, whatever their reasoning may be. We're a cross-disability organization, so we have apprentices who are low vision, hard of hearing, have cerebral palsy, any disability. They're all welcome at Respectability. Policy, our policy team advocates at the local, state, and federal level for just practices for individuals with disabilities. We reach out to governors, policymakers, members of the White House. In fact, we actually have a former apprentice who's working on the White House Committee for People with Intellectual Disabilities, which is really exciting. Our entertainment and news media team, we consult on movies and TV shows to ensure accurate representation, that people with lived experience are in writers' rooms and at decision-making tables. And finally, our faith inclusion focuses on making sure that people with disabilities are welcome and included in all faith-based communities. As I mentioned previously, the ADA does not actually protect religious organizations, and so they're not required to be fully accessible. And that's one of the things that we advocate for, is full inclusion in faith-based communities.
Disability impacts everyone. It impacts people of all races, sexual orientations, and gender identities, faiths, and backgrounds. Today, I will speak on the intersections that I live, not only as a woman with a disability, but a pansexual woman with a disability. And I'm going to talk about how this intersection really impeded me from coming out and accepting this side of myself. So I'm one of the people at Respectability who is hard of hearing. I've lived with hearing loss my entire life as a result of chronic ear infections resulting in heavy scars and surgery. But while this was going on, boys were not exactly the kindest to me. Plenty of them called me retarded and had little to no patience with me because lower ranges are the hardest ones for me to hear. Subsequently, I went to a single-sex school. I did not spend a whole lot of time with boys. And when I went to a single-sex high school, a friend of mine developed a crush on me and followed me everywhere. Between not spending time with boys and this particular friend, all of the non-disabled people insisted they knew my sexuality better than I did. They insisted that they already knew I was gay, in part because, as I mentioned, I couldn't really go near guys, so obviously I had not had a boyfriend. I was trying to be adamant. No, this is how I feel. No, this is my life. This is who I like. It felt as though every time a non-disabled person told me they knew better, I had to push back harder just to show who I was. And then going to a women's college, the non-disabled people pushed their ideas about me harder and harder. And it felt like a constant push-pull just to be able to say who it is that I am. As I got older, though, and I met more and more people, I realized, wait, there are some really beautiful people in this world. There are some really amazing individuals. And the more people I met, the more I was like, wait a minute, I'm feeling a particular way about you. And then that particular way, it stopped just being for guys. I started meeting women and non-binary individuals who every time I saw them, I felt my heart skip a beat. I felt myself getting blushy. And the more people I met like that, the more I realized, wait, I'm actually not straight, but this is my identity. This isn't because non-disabled people are telling me who I should and shouldn't be. I am genuinely in love and feeling strong emotions. I am genuinely drawn to this person so much that the touch of their hand means so much, where it's more than a whole date with another person who really can't get my heart started at all. And only because I was able to go out and not only meet more people, but really reclaim my identity from non-disabled people, that I was able to accept myself as pansexual. And I'm so thankful that I finally could, because there are so many people in my life who have touched me on a deep level, who have etched themselves into my heart that I carry with me forever. If you go to respectability.org and read my piece called The Roommate, you will read all about one of them, someone to whom I still speak, even after we had to go separate ways, and someone whom every time I think about them, I still get a little blushy. But speaking on different intersections though, in the next slide, I want to make a point of amplifying voices, voices of people of color with disabilities. As you see in this presentation, Molly and I are both white. There are experiences on which we can't speak. And all of these individuals right here, they have lived with the intersections of racism and ableism. And it's been very open how it's impacted not only their lives emotionally, but also in their careers. Heck, one of the reasons why I love following Demi Lovato is because she takes so much ownership, not only of this intersection, but also with the fact that they're very open about being genderqueer as well, and going by both they, them, and she, her pronouns. Every single person in this slide has a critical voice in our community. And it's really important that when we have privilege, we make a point of acknowledging the limitations of our experiences and the limitations on the things which we can speak. It's been criticized before that the disability movement can sometimes be too white. And this is why in every intersection, we must continue amplifying voices.
Organizations are at their best when they welcome, respect, and include people of all backgrounds, and this includes people with disabilities. We know this to be true, but people with lived disabilities and lived experience know the problems their community faces and know the solutions that work best. People with disabilities represent a largely untapped pool of talent, and hiring people with disabilities is just plain good business sense. They bring skills and innovation that can transform businesses. In fact, a study by Accenture found that companies that stood out for their disability employment practices had 28% higher revenue, double the net income, and 28% higher revenue than other companies that did not focus on disability inclusion. Through our National Leadership Program, which I explained previously, we place philanthropy apprentices into externships within outside grant-making organizations. Often, the apprentices reported that most companies have the resources available and are excited to bring on employees with disabilities, but to ensure real inclusion takes intentional learning and listening to succeed. Accommodations as simple as turning on the captions in Zoom calls and training videos, or ensuring that documents are screen reader accessible, can make all the difference. Individuals who disclose their disability or need for an accommodation often shatter the glass ceiling and pave the way for more employees with disabilities in the future. We thought the statistic on the screen was telling, that only 8% of grant makers employ a person with disability, and people with disabilities only make up 1% of staff at these organizations. Because people with disabilities know the solutions that work, it is so important to get people with lived experience on your board, staff, and seats at decision-making tables so that they can pave the way for more employees with disabilities in the future. Some examples of the importance of lived experience in shattering glass windows or glass ceilings come along with the problem-solving nature of professionals with disabilities. Employees with disabilities will often have to find solutions to barriers in their own work, and through this creativity, they will be able to support their peers with disabilities in the future. And if you clear the slides, I will talk about a speaker named Stella Young. While she talks about other things, she also talks about how much she has learned from her disabled peers and friends. For example, she learned that she can charge her cell phone using her power wheelchair. Another example that I found particularly cool, I once heard a deaf actress at a film festival talk about missing cues on set. She and her co-stars were all supposed to turn around at the same time, but their cue was a clap. So because the crew decided to use clapping as their cue, she kept missing the turn and they had to continue to refilm because she couldn't hear the clap. Instead, another actress on set recommended using a laser pointer, which is something that she had seen been used on another set. And this worked and they were able to get the shot done. While some accommodations cost many, such as a laser pointer, are really easily done once someone advocates for an accommodation and notices the need for an accommodation, they're usually pretty simple.
Problems are best solved by working with people who have experienced them firsthand and know solutions that work. Disability is part of every issue area. The best way to accurately represent people with disabilities is to include us in the storytelling process. We know how to tell our stories because we know how to present each nuance that we live with. Some of those nuances include what it truly is like, for instance, when you're hard of hearing and you're struggling to hear someone. If you see me turning like this to you in conversation, that usually means I'm having a very difficult time with hearing and I'm trying to turn the good ear towards you to hear you better. In talking about accessibility and talking about why having accommodations for hearing loss is critical, let me tell you, doing this motion all day, it takes a toll on my neck. And eventually that strain will trigger other physical health conditions and start sending me into flares. The story at that point is an accommodation for my hearing loss. Well, it ends up being more than just about my ears. It ends up being about the rest of me too. And every disability comes with nuances that it may seem small when you take care of them on the surface and give the right support. But the truth is that it opens a whole door, not only to the best accessibility and stability possible, but to having somebody speak at your table and give a voice that might otherwise go unheard. If I were doing this every single day of my life still, I likely would not have the energy to speak with all of you today. I would probably be in bed with another bout of severe pain or vertigo. That's very clearly not the case because of the accessibility I have here today.
As previously mentioned, there's so much unfair bias against people with disabilities, and language has proven very important. As Christina has spoken to, the disability community is widely intersectional, meaning that individuals feel the compounding effects of racism, ableism, homophobia, and other forms of discrimination. There's a video linked here on the bottom of your screen from Stella Young, and it's about 10 minutes, so we don't have time to watch it now, but I really encourage everyone to watch it at a later time. Stella Young talks about her experience as a wheelchair user and what is often referred to as inspiration porn. Stella is the one who talks about using her power wheelchair as a phone charger. But I can provide some examples of what Stella means when she says the phrase inspiration porn. In her speech, she flashes images on the screen of a young girl with Down syndrome running with the quote, "Before you quit, try," and a young boy who uses a wheelchair holding a basketball in his hand with the quote that says, "Your excuse is invalid." And I feel like we've seen these images and videos shared on Facebook. You could probably recognize them. But Stella uses the term inspiration porn because people with disabilities are being objectified for the benefit of non-disabled people. She explains that often what disabled people are quote unquote overcoming are not because of their bodies or diagnoses, but because of the limits that society puts on them. The term is often used to indicate that people with disabilities are incapable of doing things worth celebrating. So instead, we will celebrate a boy in a wheelchair who plays basketball. This is a wildly inaccurate picture of what people with disabilities are capable of. So Stella recommends the social model. The charity model says that people with disabilities need to be taken care of. The medical model states people with disabilities must be cured. But instead, we strive for the social model, which says that society is what needs to change to be accessible for people with disabilities.
And one of the changes that needs to be made is emphasizing the idea that disability is not a bad word. Plenty of people, when talking about disability, will treat the word disability as if it's akin to the F-bomb, using that when talking about a person or describing them. For so many people, it's like, I don't see you as disabled. You're not really disabled. All of those types of phrases not only make it harder to talk about disability, it makes it harder to embrace the disability identity as well. There's nothing dirty about the word in the slightest. It is merely stating what is because of societal barriers as mentioned by the social model. If anything, we need to say the word disability more often so we can acknowledge what is created in the definition of the social model and figure out how to dismantle it to make everything more accessible. But it all begins with saying one single word and knowing that that word is not dirty. As mentioned earlier, it's not a bad word. I will emphasize that as much as need be. Now, when it comes to talking about non-disabled people, the social model also reflects that non-disabled is a preferred term to able-bodied or normal. Able-bodied is not the preferred term because sometimes disability focuses on neurodivergence specifically. By that point, there isn't any chronic illness involved. So when you say able-bodied or abled, that's leaving out the elements of disability caused by inaccessibility for neurodivergent individuals. And normal? What is normal anyway? There's no one true definition of normal. It's fluid and changing all the time, making normal a near impossible standard for anyone to achieve. So by that point, non-disabled becomes a far better term to say because it's standard. We know what non-disabled is. It's not going to change in the same way people define normal. And please, oh please, do not use euphemisms like differently abled or special needs. With the idea of differently abled, it's as though, oh, this one part of you doesn't work, so we're going to give you this power instead. You're going to be differently abled because you have these special powers. I'm still waiting on my psychic powers. I live with disability, but I got no magic powers or psychic powers to compensate. If we really live in a world where we're differently abled, come on, I want my psychic powers. And as for special needs, there are no particularly special elements to accessibility. It is a human need. It is a basic part of allowing everybody to come together. If an individual can't access a group or an event, that person will get closed out. Being allowed to participate and join so many parts of life, it's not a special need. It is a human need. And calling it a special need, that implies that it's something both unique and superfluous. There is nothing special about a need that is as crucial to everyday life as breathing and eating. And with the idea of victim words, it does more than just create a one-dimensional image of disability. It takes away the autonomy from the person about whom you're speaking. If you say something like, he suffers from cerebral palsy, you don't know if he's suffering. Have you asked him about it? Do you know what it is that he truly feels? To say that someone suffers from it, that implies that you know better. And as I mentioned earlier, when talking about how I came to embrace my pansexuality, the idea of non-disabled people knowing better creates a whole series of barriers in and of themselves. Whereas if you say he has cerebral palsy, that's just stating what is. That's just stating the truth of the situation. How he feels about his cerebral palsy, that's up for him to say. But in terms of an everyday description, saying he has cerebral palsy, it's not that different from saying, I have red hair, or I have a hearing aid. And when talking about different devices, let's continue to the idea of confined to a wheelchair. People will say that phrase all the time, but in truth, the wheelchair is not confining at all. The confinement comes from inaccessible spaces. Confinement comes from an instance where there is only stairs when what you need is a ramp. And in Stella Young's speech about inspiration porn, she very openly says, no amount of smiling ever turns stairs into a ramp. And that is why when we talk about being bound to something, no, the binding in this case has nothing to do with a mobility device. It has to do with the structural inequities, literally, in quite a few cases. Saying wheelchair user instead acknowledges that, again, wheelchair use is a part of this person's everyday life. This is just part of who they are. This is just part of what they need. But saying confined to a wheelchair, you're forcing people into the medical model specifically and taking away their definitions of who they really are. And with common ableist language, we've got several examples here, but I'm going to turn to the word spaz specifically because it's been the center of conversation around one of Lizzo's songs. She used spaz in one of her lyrics, considered an ableist slur against people with spastic movements. And when Lizzo had this brought to her attention, she said, you know what? It is not in my character to use slurs. Let me correct this so everyone can enjoy it. It was an instance where talking about disability, instead of a non-disabled person becoming defensive, she recognized her error, she corrected it, and then the song was made accessible and enjoyable by everyone again. You can always remember, avoid saying phrases like the disabled, because you wouldn't say the females or the gays. If you say it like that, you can hear why saying the disabled is pejorative. Instead, it's better to say the disability community because it acknowledges the whole group and will lead that into how people choose to talk about disability in person first language versus identity first language, and how the two can be mixed to talk about identity versus states of being triggered by an illness. Within the person first model, we say person with a disability. In the identity first model, we say disabled person. Now, there are several groups that have always used identity first language, like the deaf community, particularly with sign language and the multiple sign languages across the world. By that point, saying the deaf community, you're opening the door to a whole culture, rich with beautiful history, rich with language structure that has a whole story far beyond what we hear and know in oral languages. And within the autistic rights community, that is always referred to as identity first as well. But when I talk about mixing the two, I talk about how with very specific illnesses and disabilities, sometimes a change in language can signal a change in the state of being. I'm going to be very candid with everybody today. Right now, I am both depressed and obsessive compulsive. I live with clinical depression and OCD in general, but when I say I am depressed and obsessive compulsive, it means I am struggling with both in that moment. I have been dealing with a depressive episode for several days, and when I speak publicly, I become obsessive compulsive because I'm terrified of using the wrong word or saying the wrong thing, or I'll have intrusive thoughts about huge disasters if I make one mistake, or how if I say the wrong word, everything I've worked for is going to be thrown out the window, my life will be ruined, and it will be all my fault. I'm still here speaking to you while in these states, but these states are a very real and raw part of living with clinical depression and OCD. And as I mentioned, living with them means that they generally exist. But when I say I'm depressed and I'm obsessive compulsive, it means they are happening to me right now. Every individual, though, has their own way of talking about disability. I talk about my depression and OCD in this way, but another individual may talk about it very differently. That is why we go to the rule of ATP, ask the person, because at the end of the day, that person will know how to talk about their disabilities better than anyone else. For the National Center of Disability Journalism Language Guide, it is widely acknowledged that people with disabilities are frequently undercovered by the mainstream press, or that coverage is inaccurate or incomplete. The National Center on Disability and Journalism does not advocate a particular point of view. It is concerned with the journalistic principles of accuracy, fairness, and diversity in news coverage. RespectAbility frequently uses the NCDJ guide in our own communication efforts. Let me give an example of how accurate representation within journalism matters. If you were to write an article about me, for instance, in relation to hearing loss and how to speak other languages comfortably while living with hearing loss, you wouldn't mention my history with Lyme disease. You wouldn't mention the clinical depression or the migraines. None of those things are relevant to the story. If there were any other disorder to mention, it would be the OCD, but only because of how the perfectionism about words intersects with the struggles with hearing loss. By that point, both are incredibly relevant to how the experience is depicted. It's akin to writing fiction in a way. If you've been to a creative writing class, then you felt the chop of a creative writing teacher when they say that part of the story is not relevant. That part of the story is detracting from the core of what you want to write. Take it out. In that regard, talking about disability is no different than improving your creative writing. Make sure everything in your story matters when you present it. Superfluous details or mentioning, hey, they have a disability just because the disability exists, it doesn't do any favors in representation. If anything, it ends up slowing us down. If you're going to mention disability in journalism, make it count.
So while this was an intro to disability presentation, we encourage you to continue your disability inclusion journey. Feel free to email Jake using the email on the screen, jakes@respectability.org. You can always reach out to Christina or myself. Visit the RespectAbility website, and we will have time for questions at the end of the webinar. But On RespectAbility's website, you could see more about our Disability Training and Speakers Bureau. We have experts in a variety of areas, including athletics, religion, or faith-based communities, entertainment, accessibility in organizations, accessibility in your events, and the list goes on. So we encourage you to kind of peruse our website and see if there are any topics that you find particularly interesting, and if you want to learn more about disability inclusion. We also have an Equity and Access webinar series where we talk about the history of disability, premium skills workshop and social media accessibility, how to make your organization's social media accessible to a wide audience, how to ensure a welcoming lexicon and inclusive storytelling if you want to continue your journey to talk about more vocabulary, recruitment, accommodations, and again, we just welcome you to visit our website. So thank you. Now I think that we can open up to some questions.
We had a couple of questions about volunteering with RespectAbility, and I think it's a good thing. So let me make sure I find the question. And I'll also just ask you to talk a little bit about how you all ended up working with RespectAbility, because I think you did go through a particular program. So yeah, we had some people interested in not working for RespectAbility necessarily, but volunteering. How can they help?
Sure. So we can kind of take the second half of that question first. Christina and I both started through the apprenticeship program, which is the National Leadership Program. I was focused on public policy and employment at the time. And so the team I was on was me and 3 other individuals, and we were reaching out to local policymakers, doing research, writing press releases. And then we also got writing training. So we met with a writing coach who taught us how to do professional writing, kind of fine tune our writing skills. So we were introduced to a large network. RespectAbility's apprenticeship has hundreds of alumni, so that network has been super helpful. And I think that would be the largest place to volunteer is possibly being a network connection or mentor to the apprenticeship program. But if Jake and Christina have any other answers, I'd welcome you to it.
Yeah, I know before COVID started, we did a lot of volunteer things. Things have slowed down, especially in person. We don't do much in person anymore. I know, for example, this past weekend, we had an in-person event in LA that we needed volunteers for. So stuff just comes up every now and again. I would say joining our newsletters would be the best way to do that, which is at respectability.org/join us, I believe is the URL. And I can also share how I got started, which was also in the apprenticeship program. I was on a team of 2, so it was just me and my supervisor, and it was the community outreach and impact department at the time. She then stepped down after like 2 months for an exciting position at the Cerebral Palsy Foundation. And I went full-time kind of into her role, but in a slightly adjusted role. I'm technically the first person to ever hold the position of Disability Training and Speakers Bureau Associate at RespectAbility. It's been really fun. I have made a lot of great connections in the nonprofit field, in the foundation field, in many different corporate industries. Law firms. It's been a really interesting experience, and I've just learned a lot.
I came to RespectAbility as a nonprofit apprentice. I wanted to make sure I kept a hand in the nonprofit world because my career ended up having a really rocky journey between 2016 and 2021. So around 2016, I ended up getting Lyme disease, and I didn't realize it was from working with animals at the time. I have worked with hundreds of cats and dogs, and sometimes they have ticks. One of them crawl onto me. I got bitten, and it took 2 years for them to figure out it was Lyme disease at all. I was originally working at an animal nonprofit, so I tried to stay in the nonprofit world by going back into development at Citizen Diplomacy International. Did a brief time there in an internship. Right after it ended, though, pandemic. The whole world ended up closing its doors in so many ways, and then a lot of nonprofit jobs ended up not only being closed, but also a lot of places were saying we're having a hiring freeze right now, we're not taking anybody. So I ended up having to work retail for another 2 years or so just to make sure that I had some sort of income. In January, I found people online mentioning respectability, saying this is a great way to transition your career, to keep yourself within your desired field. And I thought, this is it. This is how I'm going to stay in the nonprofit world. This is how I'm going to get back into it after 2 different problems with 2 different infectious diseases, one of which it took me almost a year and a half to get after it got to the rest of the world. For so long, I was thinking, I don't even have this and it's still wrecking my career. What's going on here? But respectability not only helped me get back on track for the nonprofit world, they gave me great tools to support other forms of business as well. If you take a look around at this background, this is one of the sections of Zen Wellness Studio, which is a yoga studio that specializes in coaching and supporting chronically ill individuals. I am able to take my skills at respectability and use them to help support this business as it continues to grow. Even things like the writing coach were able to help me out in this support because of the principle of plain language. I found that plain language works excellently for social media and opens up concepts of wellness that might otherwise be inaccessible. Respectability has done so many amazing things for me from the moment I first came in as an apprentice, and it continues to help my world grow. If you're not sure about whether or not you should join us, trust me, join. You are going to love every second of it, and you are going to get so much more for yourself than you could ever imagine just from watching us in this one presentation alone.
I love it. I'm ready. I'm coming. So Angela wants to know, and I love this question because I want us to feel safe to ask all the questions. What is the reason to state your physical description during introductions? I have seen this done before, but never had context about why it was done.
That's a really good question. We do that for folks who are low vision or blind so that they feel like they get the full picture of who we are, what we look like, and so that they can fully participate like they're seeing peers.
Love that. Thank you so much. Truman says,
I would also like to comment on that one, that it's interesting because not all people who are blind or low vision even really enjoy hearing the age descriptions. Like some people just don't want it. It's very much a case-by-case situation. But we use that as a practice because there are people who think that it makes it more inclusive for them. So.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and I think this kind of leads to Truman's question. Would you all agree that the most important thing when it comes to proper language is to just ask the individual you are working or conversing with? Or does this force the responsibility onto the person with the disability? Where does that line begin or end?
I think that's an instance where the 2 parties need to meet in the middle. If somebody is not speaking about their disability immediately, then anything about disability would be completely assumed. It would all be speculation. If no one openly discloses, then there is no disability in the conversation to discuss. But when somebody discloses, that is the appropriate time to ask. It's an instance where you can say, how would you like me to address you? How would you like me to address certain situations? By that point, you're asking a person about their preferences and what you can do for them to make them feel more comfortable and accepted. If you go to them right away and they haven't disclosed anything right on the nose, or as open as, say, I've been about my own disabilities, by that point, then it becomes an invasion of privacy because you don't know for sure. The best thing to do at that point is create an environment that is welcoming overall. Give them a space where they feel as though they can disclose and not feel repercussions for it.
Yeah, I agree with Christina that if someone doesn't disclose, then you shouldn't ask and you shouldn't assume anything without them disclosing first.
And that kind of leads to Brianna's question. Brianna says, I work with the blind and vision impaired community. I'm wondering if there is a particular label that I should avoid when referring to this population, i.e. vision impairment.
I think it goes back to asking each person how they would like to identify. If some people don't enjoy the term impairment, then stay away from it with those people. If I don't know, some people enjoy person first or some people enjoy identity first. Just those are things to keep in mind. Yeah, I would say it's all about asking the person.
Okay, and that is a very similar.
It could also help
go
to.
ahead.
It could also help to search for influential voices who are blind or live with low vision. I mention this because of the parallel I see with the hard of hearing community and the deaf community. How hard of hearing is the preferred term for the community at large. But if you say hearing impaired, across the board, that is considered an absolute no. Do not do that under any circumstances, because it would imply brokenness of the ear. But we're not broken. We're not broken in the slightest. It may be hard for us to hear, but that doesn't mean that we're unable to function.
Okay. And this is a similar question Samuel asked. What about person first language? Is it preferable to say a person with autism or an autistic person? I have heard both.
I think that,
So
go ahead, Jake.
you take him, Molly. No, you take him, Molly.
I was going to say that is the most widely varied identity. I think that there's a phrase that says, if you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism, because I know that specific identity really varies person to person. So that is, ask the individual, because you don't want to call someone an autistic person if they identify as a person on the autism spectrum, or use a term that for some is outdated, but others, that's what their medical diagnosis, that's what they identify with. So I would say specifically with autism, it's really important to ask the individual.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Also on the topic of generally first identity first person first language, there's an interesting concept that so most disability nonprofits were actually started by caregivers or parents of people with disabilities, and therefore didn't always use the language that the disability community itself was actually advocating for. And that's the beauty of RespectAbility, is that we're really a self-advocacy, nothing about us without us organization. As Molly said before, 88% of our staff identify as people with disabilities, and therefore we really are advocating for what people with disabilities want. Not only what each of our staff members want, but we're often doing surveys and focus groups to figure out what the disability community at large really wants.
That is really good to hear, because yeah, I do feel like I'm wondering already, like, wait, should I listen to you, or should I look it up, or should I ask, or should I? So it's good to know you're doing those surveys and asking the community at large. Which brings me to Lisa's comment, which is something, maybe you work in this, Molly, because you said policy and advocacy. Lisa says we need to advocate to replace organizations that use words to infantilize allies people with disabilities, like Special Olympics, Best Buddies, Buddy Ball. Again, the Special Olympics has almost no one with a disability in their upper management. Can you speak to that a little, Molly?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tough question. Yeah. It's why it's so important to be a nothing about us without us organization, and why people with disabilities should be seated at decision-making tables. It's a really tough question. Christina and Jake, I invite you guys to answer this one too, but I just think it's important to give people with disabilities the opportunities to be on boards and be in positions of power within organizations, to kind of give their voice. But yeah, I invite Christina and Jake to answer this one too, because it's tricky.
I would most definitely agree.
Yeah, Christina.
Go ahead.
No,
don't worry about it. Go ahead. I'll jump in after you.
All right. So I agree that it's very important to ask people with disabilities what they want first and foremost. However, there are some organizations, the Special Olympics and the Best Buddies were two organizations named who are both doing great work, and their efforts should not be minimized because they don't employ people with disabilities. They're doing great work and great advocacy of both of those organizations. I know, for example, I know Special Olympics is doing great policy advocacy work at the federal level, really taking the R word out of a lot of federal laws and really making a real difference in the lives for many people with disabilities. So yes, I agree that it should really be a nothing about us self-advocacy movement, but I do not want to diminish or minimize the efforts of either of those organizations or disability organizations in general.
I'll also just quickly add on to that I think that Best Buddies and Special Olympics are both household names. I think that most households have heard of those two disability organizations, which is a major feat. I'm not sure if RespectAbility is a household name yet, so I think that deserves applause in and of itself. I think that they could definitely increase having members with disabilities on their executive teams and boards and etc. But I agree with what Jake said too.
I definitely agree with what Jake said, 100%. And Molly's right, both are household names. And in seeing something like Special Olympics, the fact that it's a household name, you hear it, you instantly know what it is. And I think of how, with the way we define certain things, the one thing I can definitely say about the idea of Special Olympics, it is a special and powerful thing to break down a barrier and give people something to which they are entitled when they have the talent. And with the Special Olympics, everyone in it is talented, and what they're doing, it would still be a really special thing, because to be athletic at that level, to train that hard, to put in so many hours and think about all the ways you not only push the community forward, but you push yourself forward too. That's not an easy thing to do. And if you were to say it would be special for somebody to break records in the Olympics as well, it's still a special thing, because that is not something the majority of the population can do. That is a whole feat on a whole other level. And I think when talking about the idea of special, it's important to incorporate not only the different dimensions of what it can mean, but how it can evolve, and the fact that within this context, it is a household name already. So how can that household name and brand evolve with the community and grow with the times?
I love that, and I appreciate your answer, including evolving and growing, because it's very similar to what's going on with all language right now. We working at Candid, we're talking a lot about asset framing, and when you're asking to, you're writing a grant proposal and you're trying to get the funds, there are these words that are cringy, poor, minority, underserved, all of these different things that make people feel like there's a hero and a victim. And so we're changing a lot of taxonomy as well. And that kind of leads to and addresses Robert's question. He says, my question is how do you navigate the tension between being intentional about the use of inclusive language, because this absolutely matters, and using non-inclusive language such as special needs because it grants access to necessary funding streams or services. And I just wanted to say we're trying to move that, and I think the grant writers move that, these conversations move that language forward, and we evolve and grow, like you said, Christina. But yeah, if either any of you can kind of address that, and I guess Molly, since you're in development, how do you kind of navigate that tension?
Yeah, I can take that. So we use person first language pretty much across the board. At RespectAbility, we don't use terms like special needs or differently abled. I think just sticking to best practices is what I would encourage. And I think that language is changing, and I think that more people are becoming more aware of what is correct language. And so I encourage you to use person first language. And if it comes up in a conversation with a funder, if you're on a Zoom call, I would just politely say, well, we've changed our language, now we're using this. We're constantly changing our language, we're constantly learning. And so I think maybe if you're in a conversation with someone who uses different language, say, well, we've adapted our language and now we're using this term to be more inclusive. And I think that nobody's going to fight with inclusion. I think that if you say we're updating our language because we learned that this is more appropriate or this is more encompassing, I think that nobody's going to fight you on that.
I like that. I have definitely been saying that in our proposal writing courses, and then also acknowledging the fact that when you go to look for grants within Foundation Directory, for instance, those old terms are still there, and that's how you have to find funding. So we're changing those things. It's a little slower to change because of all of the statistics and numbers connected to those words. It's not just, too simple. It's not simple, but I am acknowledging that as we talk to our people in our classes. So speaking of special needs, Tarika wants to know what's a more acceptable word for special needs in the field of education, because even teachers and parents still use the euphemism in casual conversations.
It's perfectly fine to say accessibility. It's perfectly fine to say it's an accessible part of the class. It's another instance where you can say the word disability or accessibility and it's not going to be dirty. You can also reference it with specific titles for specific items too. I think of how when I was 11, for instance, no one was using the term special needs when I had to bring an assistive listening device to class. They just said she needs an assistive listening device. It's okay to refer to the item directly and say it's for this particular part of accessibility. She needs an assistive listening device because she can't hear you. It's okay to be that plain in language. It doesn't imply brokenness or dirtiness or somehow that you're so radically different and special just for having this type of body. Accessible needs are human needs. It's okay to say accessible needs or name the need specifically.
There are a lot of laws out there that use words that the disability community would no longer use, such as special education or handicap parking. No one would say either of those anymore in the disability community. So at this point, I think a lot of the I think actually a lot of the education sector is actually realizing that a lot of the words are outdated, but they can't do much about it because those are the words that are in the laws and those are the words that they're told to use. So I think that, as Christina said, just telling these children that identifying as having a disability is not a bad thing, and it's okay to identify as having a disability because there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's really good. But I think it's still quite a while before we actually change the words accessible parking, accessible handicap bathroom, handicap parking, special education, stuff like that.
I think I totally agree with what Jake just said. And I think the one tip, I would just stay away from the word normal. Like I would say, well, they're not taking normal classes or they're not in normal education. I think that using the language that your school uses, it is what it is, but I would just stay as far away from the word normal as you can. Because what is normal?
And then I'll pose this question from Derova, who says, I feel nervous about being my authentic self at work as a disabled person. I have PTSD, and sometimes I have hard days where I can't participate in meetings at all or fully participate. Some days I am irritable or hypervigilant or have other symptoms. Unfortunately, this leads most of my colleagues to believe I'm standoffish, cold, etc., because of the way I act or that I opt out of participating in certain things. Do you have recommendations of how I can build rapport and trust to combat this bias?
I think the way elements of the PTSD were phrased in the question were absolutely a great start to how to talk about it. There's a lot more grasped in this question than one would initially realize. And I mention that as someone who has the lived experience. I've lived with PTSD for a very long time. I know the whole thing of being hypervigilant or having those really bad flashback days or nights where you didn't sleep just because it kept coming up before your eyes every time you closed them. It can give the appearance of being standoffish if you're genuinely prepared for an attack. But it's important to say things like, I'm sorry, or not even say I'm sorry, saying this is nothing personal to you, this is not about anything you said or did, this is the type of thing that I live with, this is part of my everyday. I greatly appreciate your support. When you're coming out about living with a mental illness of any sort, be it PTSD, clinical depression, or OCD, anytime somebody gives you support, it's important to acknowledge, not just to keep progress going, but also so they know when it genuinely is a really bad day for you. Showing that kindness when you have more capacity to do so, it helps draw those distinctions between being standoffish and cold in general versus I'm on edge because of trauma. All of these little things in the way that we interact and breaking it down in bits and pieces for others to understand, it makes a difference. Now, the way I phrase PTSD with other people is how it's like when the doctor taps on your knee and you kick whether you want to or not because it's a reflex. Well, it's the same idea, except with PTSD, it's tapping on your brain in relation to certain traumas. And when you tap on those parts of the brain, they're going to go off whether or not you want to. And it's got nothing to do with what's happening in that particular moment or with whether or not the individual has done something wrong. It's just tapping the brain and the reflex goes off.
So I agree with Christina that it's all about choosing the right language. But the way the question was posed, it sounded like this person isn't sure if they feel comfortable disclosing. And honestly, there's no way that we can really help with that. If you are if your work environment isn't making up an environment where you feel comfortable disclosing, or you just don't feel comfortable disclosing for whatever reason, we can't really do much with that. I would think that, you know, you don't have to come out and say that you have PTSD. You can just say, I'm dealing with stuff. This is my, I don't know, you can use the word like defense mechanism if you want. And as Christina said, you can say like, it's not personal. Like, you don't need to disclose your disability, but you can just disclose the symptoms and say I am acting this way. There is a reason I'm acting this way, and it is a personal reason. And yeah, I'll share more when I feel more comfortable, when I feel comfortable enough to do so.
I just thought of another way to combat this too. I'm thinking of when I first told my partner about PTSD. English is not his first language. I couldn't use a lot of the complex terms about it because I didn't know them in Italian. So I had to simplify the language as much as I possibly could. That's part of how I came up with the metaphor for the reflexes. I didn't tell him the exact details of the PTSD in the beginning. I would just say the reflexes are going off again. And the plainness was enough to let him know what was going on. So if you want to try different ways to disclose, imagine talking about your PTSD to someone who is learning that language for the very first time. How would you say it to somebody who doesn't grasp the language as easily as others, but help them understand what's going on with you?
I love that. Yeah, I think understanding is what we all kind of want. Did you want to add something, Molly?
Yeah, just really quickly, I would say take advantage of all the accommodations available to you. I want to emphasize that accommodations are not unique to people with disabilities. Parents stay home when their kids are having a sick day from school. That's an accommodation. People require materials in different language. That's an accommodation. So the list of accommodations goes on. And if you are able to take a 15-minute break and step outside, or bring a pair of headphones and listen to music that makes you feel calm, I would just say, don't feel uncomfortable asking for accommodations. If it's something that will make you more productive and more comfortable, it's definitely worth advocating for.
Great. And just so you know, you're getting a lot of thank you, great presentation. Thank you all for taking the time. This was informative. Thank you. I've learned a lot. So a lot of thanks. And then, and a lot of people have left. And one of the, Lisa, who had commented about the household names, she gave the suggestion, why don't we change this to Unified Olympics? That was something she thought. She's no longer in the room, but I wanted to make sure we saw that. And then excellent presentation. Thank you so much. That was amazing. And then I'm going to ask this question as a former teacher. I'd like to know this answer as well. Natalie is a current teacher on sabbatical. Natalie wanted to know, is respectability.org a good site to refer secondary students with disabilities who have parents, guardians, school officials, that they are guiding them towards at-home or computerized jobs despite student interest in welding, automotive repair, or even in the medical field of medical assistant? Basically, where can students go to gain or encourage support in their discussion towards adults who want to enable the disability more than the desire of the person?
There are school to work transition programs. There's a number of different transitional programs that don't necessarily focus on at-home work that requires sitting behind a computer. So I would encourage you to look at the school to work transition programs and look at the different types of areas that they focus in, because I know that there are, I can't think of the names off the top of my head, but I know that there are organizations that do focus on hospitality, mechanic work.
I have a couple to note. So there's Marriott Bridges to Work is one of those programs. Project Search is one of those programs, I guess. Marriott Bridges does some great work, some really, really cool work. Project Search is mainly based in the medical field, but those are two organizations to look into.
And do you think going to RespectAbility's website would be helpful for those secondary students to kind of just see what resources there are out there?
Yeah, I know that both Project Search and Bridges are both listed on our website, and so I'm sure that there's a list that includes other options as well. I would recommend, yeah, RespectAbility's website for that.
Okay. And then we had a good comment from Michelle. Everyone's very has these very long long comments, but they're good. As an attorney with a lifelong hidden disability, epilepsy, and a decade-old physical mobility disability, walker wheelchair, it is very important people in our community realize we are not a single need community. The needs of a hard of hearing person in a building fire, flashing lights, or an alarm are diametrically opposed to the needs of epileptics. Flashing lights frequently cause seizures. A person with a cane or foldable walker wants the shortest access to a building entrance, whereas a motorized wheelchair user wants a reasonably sloped ramp and doesn't care how long or out of the way the ramp is. What Michelle wants is for us to be aware of the needs of disabilities other than your own, so we don't inadvertently undercut each other's accommodations. Is that something you kind of find as you're doing your work? Jake, I'll let you take that first.
Yeah, accessibility is a tricky thing. So my partner has a non-epileptic seizure disorder. So she can't have flashing lights during when the fire alarm is going off, which also makes it inherently inaccessible for people who are blind. So accessibility is a tricky thing, in that some things are accessible for some and not accessible for others. I know I have a neuromuscular disability and don't like to walk far ways or upstairs sometimes, which the walking far ways, as you said, someone with a scooter or a wheelchair doesn't really care about that all the time. Yeah, accessibility is tricky. That's my answer to that one.
And even in your own body, it can be tricky, because sometimes you're throwing aside one disability to accommodate the other. Because when you mentioned flashing lights for people who are hard of hearing, there are times where certain flashing lights, they'll trigger a migraine in me. And I'm not simply talking about the classic migraine with aura, where you get a lot of pain, the aura, and severe nausea and vomiting specifically. I'm talking about hemiplegic migraine, where you're slurring your words. Half your body starts to slow down. Worst case scenario, you're having those symptoms, the classic migraine symptoms, and you can't feel half your face. So in an instance like that, it's like, do I accommodate the hearing loss for something flashing would be much better, or do I accommodate the hemiplegic migraine where something flashing could be a really bad trigger if I'm not careful? By that point, it's figuring out which one's going to be easier to work with in an emergency. By that point, in the case of a fire, I'd rather not trigger the hemiplegic migraine, because that's going to be harder to get out. So in talking about accessibility and different issues, it's more than just balancing things with other individuals too. It's sometimes balancing your own body and the way certain accessibility needs can be at odds with each other.
Wow, thank you so much. We have learned so much today. There are other questions we didn't get to, but I'm going to send them to you guys behind the scene anyway, just so you can kind of see what people are thinking about as you present. With that, I just want to say thank you to Molly, Christina, and Jake. I also want to thank everyone who attended today's webinar. We appreciate you taking your time out. If you like this webinar, we hope you'll join us again soon. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks again, the team at RespectAbility.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.